Hi guys, so I am currently on the watt bike doing a low intensity endurance zone 2 ride. So kind of different terms, all kind of describing a similar thing. I thought it was a good opportunity to maybe jump on and just talk quickly about what that actually means, because it's zone 2 or endurance or aerobic training or whatever you want to call it. It's become really popular in the last kind of 5 to 10 years maybe. And I think it's maybe just an example of something that people are doing because they think it's important, which I'd argue it is, but understanding of it is maybe not quite there sometimes in terms of what it actually is. Also, like the level it sits at, maybe some of the benefits around it, what it actually means from a physiological standpoint, so what's actually happening inside your body. Because I think people maybe just take it as easy without really understanding what that means. So people either under or overshoot it a little bit, or just don't execute it in a way that's maybe most effective to get the benefits from that style or that intensity of training. So zone systems typically sit on a kind of 5, maybe 7, sometimes less 3 levels, depending on what sort of school of thought you're approaching it from. And maybe like how you divide up your intensities in your training. And that can be from sort of as simple as just easy, moderate, hard, to kind of more comprehensive or more sort of built out intensity zones, which have like maybe 1 to 5, which maybe sits at kind of different levels, with 5 being kind of max output sprint, and then 0 being like resting state, and obviously all the levels between that. But typically we kind of look at a zone 2 as sitting towards the lower end of that, but kind of the first level of like real work intensity, I suppose, so above a resting state. So what does zone 2 actually mean? So really there's a couple of ways we can look at it and break it up. So from a heart rate perspective, we typically look at it sitting between 60 and 75% of max heart rate. So whatever value is your max, there's ways to calculate. So 220 minus your age is kind of a really basic way of doing it. If you're more regularly training, then you can just take it as the highest value you've seen. So if you're doing kind of interval or high intensity training, just taking it as the highest value you've ever seen is a good way of kind of field testing or field aligning your max heart rate. Or you can kind of do more structured tests to slowly ramp up, like a VO2 max test or something, where at the end of that test you should be pretty close to your max level of output, and so the value you achieve with a heart rate at that point is probably pretty close to your max. But it's different for everybody, and max heart rate will vary with age, training status, all number of other factors that factor into what your max heart rate is, and it will in theory decline as you age. So even really fit athletes, their max heart rate will start to decline to whatever degree as they get older. Looking then maybe at looking more at a more physiological way, or attributing that to like power output, we might look at anywhere from probably 50 to 70% of like an FTP might sit roughly in that kind of that aerobic power zone. But important to understand is that above or below that by 10% maybe is probably still getting some of the benefits. So just because we exceed what would be a zone 2 doesn't mean we've lost all the benefits of that. And just because we drop too low equally doesn't mean we've lost all the benefits of that. We just start to grey a little bit the lines and what physiologically we are working on at those zones. So if we take resting as zone 0, say in this kind of 5-zone model, so that's anything from doing nothing, obviously, up to like very light exercise. So we kind of look at that as lowest level of intensity, where breathing rate doesn't necessarily change. If we're looking more physiologically, fuel usage doesn't necessarily change that much. Really easy intensity at a very low level. Above that, we then have zone 1, and then leading into zone 2, which is Again, low relative intensity, but above that resting state. So this is anything where we're going very easy. Our heart rate hasn't really shifted all that much. We haven't really noticed any significant changes in our breathing. And then we come up to that kind of bottom end of zone 2, into zone 2, which is then what we term as like a fat max point. So this is the point at which relatively we are burning the highest percentage of fat as fuel. So our body at lower intensities will be burning predominantly fat as a fuel source. And then that shifts more towards carbohydrates as we get to higher intensities. And this fat max point is the kind of delineator between zone 1 and then into zone 2. So where we are starting to burn the most as a percentage of fat is that kind of delineation between where zone 2 starts. And you kind of take that generally as like when we start to breathe more heavily. So that's another indicator, is ventilatory threshold 1, VT1, which is where there's a change in our breathing. So you can tell me now, my breathing has changed from resting state. I'm having to breathe at a greater rate than if I were just sitting, or if I were just resting or sitting at a very, very low intensity. So generally we look at that as you can talk in complete sentences. So obviously now I can talk in sort of 15 to 20 word sentences quite comfortably, but I do have to stop and take breaths in between that. I can't have an extended conversation. So I've hit that point of like my ventilatory threshold, so a change in my breathing. What we look at then is maybe the top end of zone 2. So the other side of that, kind of lactate threshold or aerobic threshold, sometimes called. So this is kind of the end of zone 2 and approaching what we call a crossover point. So this is where we see a like significant rise in lactate, blood lactate, above baseline. So we typically take this as 2 millimoles per litre, which is a sort of more physiological term, obviously. That's the actual levels of lactate in your blood. So resting levels will always sit at something. It's never zero. We are always creating lactate in our body, but our body is using it or recycling it at a rate that matches the rate of production. So when we start to get into that zone 2 and above, going from what we could term as sustainable output to more of an unsustainable output. So that's the kind of full mark of zone 2, is it is something that's sustainable for long, long periods of time, if you feel enough, in theory, indefinitely. And when we rise above that, it's taken as our blood lactate shooting above a 2 millimole level. So this kind of arbitrary level above baseline. And that's where we then hit what we call the max sustainable fat usage. So above that, we then start to burn relatively more carbohydrate in comparison to fats. And that's the delineation really between zone 2 and then zone 3 or higher, is the point at which carbohydrate then becomes the predominant fuel source. So we have that fat max, which is where fat reaches its highest point in terms of relative percentage usage as fuel. And then we have maybe a carb max, you could call it, or a crossover point, where fat, carbs and fat flip in terms of then we are burning relatively percentage-wise more carbs than we are fats, and that delineates higher intensities above zone 2. So when we're thinking about zone 2, it's not easy. I think that's maybe a misunderstanding of it. It's not easy intensity, but it is relatively low compared to higher. So I am sitting at a comfortable heart rate, for me, around just under 150. So that is well within that range of heart rate for zone 2. But it's not easy. I'm having to breathe a little bit harder. I'm having to work a little bit harder than resting or like easy training. But from a cardiovascular or from a physiological perspective, the stress on my body is at a low level relative to higher intensities. If I were to work a lot harder, I'd be then tipping into that zone 3 or higher, which is then not the level of intensity I'm trying to target. As I said before, there's a little bit of play either side of that. So I can go a little bit lower and go a little bit higher and still get the benefits of zone 2. It's not a clear-cut step process. It's kind of a slow increase, but getting the most benefits at or below that point of using the most carbs as fuel, or where I get significant changes in my breathing rate, or if I get significant changes in my blood lactate if I were testing for that. So people can go too easy, too hard. If you're walking, for example, unless you are really deconditioned or really unfit, walking is probably not enough of a stressor to hit that zone 2. But on the other side of that, running, biking, whatever, if you're going at too hard a point, you're not going to be able to maintain that for very long. And so therefore it's kind of sitting into that zone 3 or higher, that unsustainable. And so we're getting less of the benefits of training at that low intensity at zone 2 or an aerobic endurance type pace. And that's really the big point with it, is that zone 2 is not special, but what it does allow us to do is train for extended periods of time at that intensity. If we start to slip above that, we then lose the ability to accumulate as much volume in that zone. And so we don't get as much of the benefits as we would. If you did 10 minutes of zone 2 and that was all you achieved in a session, it's not a lot. Might not be enough of a stimulus for you to really get the kind of cardiovascular benefits of doing that. But if you did some kind of longer session where you're starting to increase, you never kind of get a plateau in terms of heart rate or a level of intensity, and you keep going up and up and up and up, trying to maintain a pace or a certain speed or a certain wattage or whatever, then you might not be working easy enough to accumulate enough volume to equally get those kind of zone 2 benefits. So it's really about finding that middle point where breathing rate has changed but not significantly. You can kind of talk in full sentences, or if you are having access to kind of physiological testing, it's the point between where you're using the most fat as a fuel source and where you start to then use more carbs as a fuel source, or lactate rises above that like real baseline of like whatever it is, typically above 2 millimole. So that's a zone 2. That's what it is. That's what it isn't. And hopefully that gives a bit more insight into what we're trying to achieve when we're training at a zone 2 or endurance or a low level aerobic intensity. Cheers. Any questions, please put them in the comments below. Like and subscribe, or reach out if you want to know any more about how to apply this sort of stuff to your training.